Hello and welcome to the latest ILM webinar, today focusing on the funding proposals recently announced by the Department of Education. My name's Andy Dent, I'm a Territory Business Manager for ILM covering the South, and joined with me today is Jake Tween. Over to you, Jake.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, I'm Jake Tween and I'm the Funding and Apprenticeships Manager with ILM.
Okay, so today's webinar is focused in two key parts. We're going to take some time just to recap the current funding models that we're working on, and then we're going to focus on the future funding models moving forward. We're conscious that there will be a real variety of individuals on the webinar today, different stakeholders, training providers and employers. And that you'll all have varying knowledge and history in terms of funding. We are conscious that there are some people that are very, very new to funding, and therefore the first few slides of today's webinar will hopefully give you some really strong guidance as to where to go next to find out the information that you require if you're engaging with funding for the first time or at an early stage.
DfE launched a consultation in August 2016 in the middle of the month, whereby they put together some proposals for apprenticeship funding, and this is what the funding will look like from May 2017. We posted this consultation on our website and also included some key information that we thought that our customers should be aware of and should feed into the consultation, and certainly we have fed in on behalf of our customers as well to highlight what we think some of the positive things are in there, but also to challenge some of the things that we think might throw up some problems for providers and employers that we work with. So hopefully you had a chance to feed into that consultation. It closed on the 5th of September. And the final rules will be published in October 2016, and they will come into effect from the 1st of May 2017.
Okay, so if you're new to apprenticeships, we've just highlighted some of the key things here that you can do to help move things forwards for you, depending on where you are in that journey. So the first thing is, on the ILM website in our Trailblazer pages, there is a number of webinars that you can access that may help you and give you some further information specific to leadership and management. We've also posted some links in the following slide to some government or DfE webinars that have recently been put up on the web that are really very useful, all around 10 to 15 minutes in length, that cover off various different topics that will really help you in an early stage of the journey. One of the key things that you do need to be aware of, and all organisations that want to continue to deliver apprenticeships moving forward will need to go on to the newly formed Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers. We're covering that in much more detail as we move through the webinar, but that will open in October this year. The other thing that you may want to consider if you're new to apprenticeships is that you may need to get an allocation or a contract to gain funding through the Skills Funding Agency. This can be quite a complex process, and you'll need to seek individual advice and guidance through the SFA. However, we have included a link here which hopefully will get you started and help you navigate through the gov.uk website, so you can find that process, that starting point a bit easier. The final point that we wanted to make here is just about one of the actions that you can take in the early days, and that's about engagement, really. And we've put employer and provider here because we know we're going to have both populations on this webinar. For providers, it's really, really important in such a changing landscape that you're engaging with employers and looking at what they need and want moving forward, and how the new standards and apprenticeships can help them grow and prosper in terms of their growth as organisations. From employers' point of view, we also know that you've got some interesting choices at this stage as to how you proceed, whether you deliver apprenticeships directly, or whether you engage with a provider, a training provider that may have expertise in this area. So it's all about having initial conversations and starting to engage with one another in a very proactive way. Okay, so we should be moving on now to the next slide. So in this slide here, we've just quoted that we would show you some of the ILM, some links to various different government sites, and you can see on here these are the links and page views that we just skipped over in terms of those 3 key webinars for you to go on to. So there's an introduction to apprenticeship funding and the levy. There's a kind of overview of the apprenticeship funding proposals, which we're covering quite a lot of today. And finally, there is a proposal around the register of apprenticeship training providers. So these are the 3 key areas that you need to start to get your head around in the early days if you haven't already done so.
Thanks, Andy. So we're going to look in a little bit of detail now at the funding models that are around in the apprenticeship world. At the moment, we have 2 models that are operating at the same time. So we've got a framework model for the framework apprenticeships, and we also have the pilot model, which is still in existence for standards, and by standards we mean the newer Trailblazer apprenticeships. So we're going to have a recap of those 2 models, but what the vision is, the DFE and the SFA, is that from May 2017 it'll be a simplified system, and rather than having 2 different models that you're trying to juggle and understand at the same time, there will be one combined model and one combined set of funding principles for apprenticeships, whether you're delivering frameworks or standards. So hopefully that'll make the landscape a lot easier to understand for providers and employers and any other stakeholders who are involved in the delivery of apprenticeships.
Okay, so I'm just going to take you through the current funding for frameworks. So for existing framework apprenticeships, this is the current world that a lot of our experienced training providers will know and love potentially, but that will be changing moving forward. So I'm just going to introduce the current state of affairs, and then Jake will take us forward from there. So in relation to the framework funding model, the framework funding model is relatively simplistic in some respects, in the fact that there's a framework set out for a relevant apprenticeship, and within that framework there's a number of qualifications that need to be achieved for the learner to complete the apprenticeship framework. Each of those qualifications has a fixed funding rate, so the delivery is completed and the funding is drawn down in the normal way, which is on kind of profile payments for learners that are in learning, basically. Those qualifications are either co or fully funded. So basically what we mean by that is that either the SFA pay the full amount or they pay part of it, generally 50%. And that's on an age banding. Basically for 16 to 18s they're fully funded generally, and then co-funded learners are generally learners that are above the age of 19. There are some variables within that, because within that there is also what we call area cost and disadvantage uplift, and basically what that means is in certain areas of the country, mainly the southeast, there is an increase to that funding because of the area that you're delivering in. And also, if the delivery of the apprenticeship or the learner lives in an area that is deemed to be disadvantaged, there is also a further uplift there potentially as well. In terms of the funding is quite straightforward, because it basically goes directly from the SFA to the allocated training provider, who would then go and deliver the training to the employer. So it's quite a straightforward transaction, straight to the provider goes and delivers the training and delivers the apprenticeship to the learner and assesses it on an ongoing basis as it currently stands. Those providers must be on what's called the Register of Training Organisations, which is affectionately known as ROTO. We're going to talk you through some of the changes moving forward, but at the moment, organisations that are delivering frameworks will be on ROTO. Organisations that are delivering frameworks at the moment will fall into 2 different categories. You'll either have what we call a prime contractor with an SFA allocation, or a subcontractor. And a subcontractor is someone that has gone through the Register of Training Organisations, but they don't have their own contract, so they link into larger providers and they draw down their funding via that larger provider through a kind of a management arrangement, really. So hopefully that gives you a good flavour for the current framework situation. Jake, have I missed anything there?
I don't think so, no. Okay, so Andy's done a recap then on what the framework funding model looks like, and now we're going to have a recap on what the standard funding model looks like, and following this we'll have a look at what that combined model is going to look like from May 2017. So the standards model in the pilot phase, so it's been around for a while now, and it's been useful for those early adopters who started delivering Trailblazers already. It's not a perfect model, but the principles it's built on are quite sound, so I think they'll probably be tweaked in the new world rather than completely revolutionized. But how does it work at the moment? Okay. Well, whereas with the framework apprenticeships you have a set rate which is based on the component qualifications, with the standards we have funding caps, so these are upper limits which can be negotiated between the provider and the employer. At the moment in the current world there are 6 caps, and they range from £1,500 to £27,000, and at the moment employers are required to pay 1/3 of the cost of that cap, and the government will contribute the remaining 2/3. There are certain employer incentives which are paid under the current pilot scheme. The provider collects these and they pass them on to the employer, and those incentives are for 16 to 18-year-old apprentices, and they are for completion of the apprenticeship and also for small employers. They are set to change, but that's what they look like in the pilot scheme. The funds still go directly to the provider. I think in an ideal world what government wants is for the funds to go to the employer so that they have the sort of purchasing power and they're more incentivized to deliver more apprenticeships. But in the current world, under the pilot, the funds go to the provider rather than the employer. And as Andy mentioned before, anybody that's involved as a lead deliverer needs to be on the register of training organisations to deliver apprenticeships. And also there are SFA allocations, so there's a procurement process that those providers would need to go through to get a contract from SFA specifically to deliver apprenticeships. So that's what the current model looks like, and that applies to all Trailblazer delivery, whether you are a large employer, a medium-sized employer. It makes no difference. That's the model that everybody currently works towards if they're delivering Trailblazer apprenticeships. So what does the future funding look like? Okay, well, as I mentioned, SFA are seeking to have a single set of funding rules that apply to frameworks and standards. So from the 1st of May, under the proposals, that's what will happen. If you're delivering a framework or a standard, it will make no difference. You will be using the same funding rules. However, within those rules, there are 2 separate models. So there are differences, and those 2 models are based on whether you're working with non-levied employers or levied employers. So it will be slightly different depending on which of those types of employers you're working with. So there are some common changes that apply to both levied and non-levied employers, so we'll just run through those with you now. One of the key differences is that both frameworks and standards will have a negotiated cap. So in the current world, the frameworks have a set rate and the standards have a cap that's negotiated between the employer and the provider. From the 1st of May, frameworks and standards will both have a negotiated cap. Okay, and the SFA is in the process of assigning caps to certain frameworks, and we'll look at that in a little bit of detail in a moment. Another key change is that the caps are increasing, so the banding will still run from 1.5 to £27,000 per apprentice, but the number of caps is increasing from 6 to 15, and that's quite a positive move, because I think if you look at the 6 caps that are in existence at the moment, at the upper end, so 4, 5 and 6, the jump is quite big between those different caps, so introducing more of them will make it a bit of a fairer system and a bit more accurate and reflective of true delivery costs. There are some new incentive payments which we're going to look at in a moment. We'll look at those caps as well. So the old incentive payments, Andy mentioned earlier on, we have things like area cost uplift and disadvantage uplift for the frameworks, and we also have those employer incentives under the pilot Trailblazer scheme. They are going to go, and from May we'll have incentive payments, new incentive payments that will apply to both frameworks and standards, and we'll look at those in a moment. One of the really positive things that's been proposed is some flexibility on the rules around prior achievement, and we think that this is going to be a real opportunity for a lot of the providers and employers that we work with, because we frequently get requests from people who are employers who want to deliver leadership and management apprenticeships to their employees, but they haven't been able to do so, or they haven't been able to draw down funding to do that, and that's because of the rules on prior achievement. So in the current world, if you have a member of staff who has a level 5 qualification, for example, you couldn't deliver a level 3 or a level 4 apprenticeship to that person. However, in the new world, you will be able to actually deliver an apprenticeship that's at a lower level than that the individual has achieved previously. So that means, for example, if you've got engineers in your business who have a level 6 qualification and you wanted to put them on a level 5 management program, at the moment you can't do that, but in the new world you will actually be able to do that. All you have to do is just confirm that you are delivering a substantial set of new skills and new knowledge to that individual. So that's a really positive move as far as we're aware. And the last key point, and this is one that we fed into the consultation and encouraged our providers to feed into, is around the endpoint assessment. So under the proposals, what will happen is the provider will have to pay for endpoint assessment up front, and 20% of the funding will be held back, and that will be released to the provider after that endpoint assessment's taken place. So we agree with the principles of that. However, we think that that number 20% probably needs looking at, because in reality a lot of the apprenticeships that we see in the endpoint assessment is priced at 10% or 15% of the cost. So having to hold back 20% doesn't seem particularly fair in a lot of cases, and we think that that's going to pose some cash flow problems, particularly for some of the smaller training providers. So, for example, if you have got 5 or 6 apprentices who are all due to take their endpoint assessment at around about the same time, you're potentially looking at tens of thousands of pounds that's being held back that you're having to pay up front and then claim back at a later date. So we don't disagree with the principle of holding back money for EPA, but we do think that 20% might need to be looked at and should potentially be lower than that. Okay, so these are the new bands. So whereas we had 6 bands before, we've now got 15 bands, and that's what they look like. So the employer and the provider can negotiate a fee that's lower than that band, that's fine. And just to reiterate that that funding is not to pay for apprentice wages or travel or any of those things. It's purely for the cost of training and assessment, and also that endpoint assessment. So I mentioned that the incentive payments are changing. Well, what do the new incentive payments look like? Well, this is a really positive one, around 16 to 18-year-olds. So what the government is doing is that they are really trying to incentivise and increase the number of 16 to 18-year-old apprentices. That's been a key kind of strategic aim of the reforms. And in order to do that, they've announced that there will be a £2,000 bonus. So for every 16 to 18-year-old apprentice that's taken on, the employer and the provider will get £1,000 each for that apprentice. And also apprentices who are 19 to 24 who previously have been in care or have an education, health and care plan will also be eligible for that £2,000 bonus. So we think that's a really positive move that will hopefully increase the number of 16 to 18-year-old apprentices. Okay, let's have a little bit of a look in slightly more detail, and I mentioned that there are 2 sort of sub-models within the common rules. So the first model is for non-levy paying employers. And actually, to all intents and purposes, it isn't all that different to the pilot scheme. So the principles and the mechanisms are broadly similar, but just the actual numbers have changed. And actually, it's looking really positive. There are more incentives now from government to deliver for the non-levy paying SMEs. So whereas in the current world, the employers are required to pay 1/3 of the cost of delivery, it's a lot more generous from May, and the employer will pay just 10%, and the government will contribute the remaining 90%. So great news for 16 to 18-year-old apprentices, great news for small businesses. And actually, if you're a small business with fewer than 50 employees, the government will pay 100% of the cost of that delivery. So that's really positive. So if you're a small business with fewer than 50 employees and you take on a 16 to 18-year-old apprentice, the government pays for that apprenticeship, they pay you £1,000, and they also pay £1,000 to the provider that's delivering the training. So some really positive stuff in there that we're very happy to see. The funds will continue to be paid directly to the provider. They won't go to the employer for non-levy paying employers. They'll go to the provider, and the provider will then do all of the delivery on behalf of the employer. Allocations will still be needed, so there is still a procurement process that will go through, and we've got some key dates at the end of this webinar, so we can make you aware of what that process looks like and when you should be submitting tenders and things like that. And lastly, the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers, which Andy mentioned before. You will need to be on that register if you're going to be involved in the delivery, and we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail shortly. So for non-levy paying employers, it's broadly the same as the pilot scheme, but it's actually a lot more generous. The government's going to contribute 90%, and if you're a small business with fewer than 50 employees, the government's going to pay the whole lot, 100%. So very positive there for small employers. Levy paying employers, okay, this is where the kind of key changes come into effect. Now the levy paying employers, they represent just 2% of employers in England. However, just to recap, these are employers who have a payroll of £3 million, and what will happen is the levy will be collected monthly via PAYE, and it'll be 0.5% of the pay bill. So employers start paying into the levy from April, and they will be able to use their digital account in the digital apprenticeship service to log in, see how much money they've got in their levy pot, basically control that and allocate spending and manage their levy pot. The government will contribute a 10% top-up towards whatever's paid monthly into that levy pot. That's really good news for levy-paying employers. And although they start paying it from April, they won't see the funds in their pot until May, so we expect a lot of that levy-paying employer apprenticeship activity to kick in from May, June next year, and that'll pick up pace as the year goes on. So this idea of a 90%, 10% contribution, that is only for the non-levied employers, okay? That doesn't apply to the levied employers. The way it works with the levied employers is they pay into the levy, they can draw the money out using the digital account, but they pay the full amount out of the funds in their digital account. If an employer finds that on a particular month they run out of money in their levy pot, they will basically temporarily revert to that non-levied model. So whatever's left over, they'll pay 10% of that, and the government will contribute the remaining 90%. Another positive thing to come out of the proposals is the idea that levied employers will be able to transfer 10% of their levy pot each year to another employer, and that's in response to, in the early days when all this was sobered on, a lot of employers said that they would like the opportunity to be able to spend some of their levy money on employers who operate within their supply chain, and by being able to transfer that 10%, that should sort of facilitate that type of activity. That won't kick in until about 2018, by which point the vision is that the smaller employers, the SMEs, will also have a digital account and will have access to that digital apprenticeship service. And also, just to recap, those new incentive payments are available for levy-paying employers as well. So if you take on a 16 to 18-year-old, you'll get £1,000, as will the provider that you're working with. Okay, we've mentioned a couple of times that there's this Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers. So the idea is that we're transitioning from ROTO onto a register that's set up specifically for apprenticeships. So this will be a single register, and anybody that's involved in the delivery of apprenticeships will need to be approved and on that register from May 2017. The register will open on the 3rd of October 2016. So it opens for applications then, and the first edition will be published in February 2017, and that will be updated quarterly. Okay. Now, there are three different routes that the SFA are looking at as part of the proposals. One of the key changes is that subcontractors will also need to be on that register. So it's not just the prime contractors, subcontractors will need to be on the register, as will any employers who... So for that reason, the SFA is proposing that there are three different routes for approval. One is the main route, so that will be used by kind of the big colleges and big training providers who are going to be delivering a lot of activity. One will be the specialist route, and that will be for those subcontractors who are delivering. And the third route will be an employer route for those employers who want to deliver part or all of their apprenticeship activity. There will be some exemptions, for example, for big kind of public sector bodies or bodies that are regulated by quangos or regulatory bodies. There'll be a little bit more lenience in there because obviously there's not much chance that a major government department's going to suddenly run out of money and fail the financial test. So there are 3 tests that will be carried out, so 3 criteria for approval to get onto this register. So the first is a financial health assessment. The second is a due diligence test. Third part is an assessment on your quality, capacity and capability. Now what SFA and DFE have said is that if you are currently delivering apprenticeships and for whatever reason you fail to get onto that register of apprenticeship training providers, they will honour the existing contracts that you've got and they'll allow you to continue and finish off the delivery of apprenticeships to those apprentices. Unless they find something seriously wrong with your delivery or your finances, they'll allow you to continue with that. And they have said that they expect it to be very few and far between where they would intervene in those circumstances.
Jake, it's Andy. Just quickly, I think you broke up when you were going through the 3 different routes. Would you mind just recapping that just for a second, if that's okay?
Of course, yeah. So what SFA are saying is that under the proposals there'll be 3 different routes. There'll be one route which is the main route, so that's for all of the big colleges and training providers who will be delivering a substantial amount of apprenticeship activity. The second will be the specialist route, so subcontractors who are delivering very specialist small components of the apprenticeship, they will have a more streamlined approval process. And the third route will be for employers who want to deliver part or all of their delivery.
Thanks, Jake.
Okay. Okay, a few other important factors. Subcontract. SFA have made it clear that they're really tightening up on this area, where at the moment you've got providers who will subcontract quite substantial parts of their apprenticeship delivery. SFA are clamping down on that, and what they said is that only small specialist components of an apprenticeship can be subcontracted from May 2017. So if you are a provider who's currently subcontracting a lot of activity, you may want to look at ways of bringing that in-house, otherwise you might find yourself in trouble with the SFA moving forward. As I mentioned before, subcontractors will need to be on the new register, but it will be a streamlined process for them. And another key thing to be aware of is that if you're a provider and you want to subcontract any of the components, you need express written permission from the employer that you're working with before you go ahead and do that. And the last thing to be aware of is there's been some clarity over eligibility for apprentices in the borders, so people who are operating on the borders between England and Scotland and Wales. At the moment it's a little bit muddy and a little bit confused, and there are lots of conflicting criteria, but from May there's going to be a single criterion, and that is that it's based on the apprentice's main place of work. So if you're operating in the borders and your apprentice works in England, they are eligible and you can get all of the funding and all of the incentives that we've just spoken about there. So it's a lot simpler. If you are operating in the borders and you have any further questions on that, get in touch with your BDM and they'll be more than happy to help you.
Okay, thanks, Jake. So just a last couple of slides, really, just to look at next steps and some key dates, really. So this slide is written from the perspective of an employer, and we thought it was important just to contextualise the decisions that are being made by employers as we speak in terms of how they move forward with their buying of apprenticeships effectively from the market, or the options in terms of delivery. So the first option that any employer may have is to actually deliver apprenticeships themselves. Obviously go through the relevant processes and steps we've talked through today. And there's a number of levy paying employers certainly that are looking at this as an option due to the scale and amounts they're going to be paying with the levy. It's kind of driving that behaviour. Secondly, there's also discussions that are happening as we speak with organisations, employers that are looking to work alongside or much more closely than we've ever seen before in terms of delivery with a provider. And things have come about like where organisations have got management and leadership development programmes that are in place and embedded within the organisation. that they want to keep, and they know that the outcomes from these map quite nicely into the knowledge, skills and behaviours potentially for the new standards. Therefore, they're asking a provider to kind of map that bit of work, or for ILM to map that bit of work, and then provide a solution to cover the remaining part of the standards, the bits that aren't covered within there. So this is a slightly different model, although things like this have happened in the past, that probably won't be as prevalent as maybe we'll see them moving forward. So we just wanted to share that with you as something that's happening. And the last option is that an employer may decide to outsource all of their apprenticeship provision to a training provider, and basically deliver it in some ways in the same way that frameworks are delivered, so that the apprenticeship training provider is delivering all of the on-program element of the actual of the standards, and then obviously they would pass over the end assessment to the independent endpoint assessment organisation. So we just wanted to highlight the three key options that employers are playing with, and obviously as a training provider you may need to adapt the way that you that you're currently engaging with employers to take on board the new world really, and the increase in flexibility in terms of how on-program elements will be delivered moving forward. Okay, so hopefully that helps just add some context, and the final slide is just some key dates. So just going to run through these. So as Jake has discussed throughout, the Register of Training Apprenticeship Training Providers opens for applications on the 3rd of October this year. You'll see a little bit further down the page there that in February 2017 we expect to see the first edition of this published. So we'll know which employers, training providers, new, old or existing, potentially have moved on to that first published register. Obviously we'll also, or providers will also know if they have been unsuccessful, and then we'll have the option to kind of re-tender or go through that process again if needed. One other point, so for those organisations that don't currently have an SFA allocation and may be looking to gain one, procurement for that commences in October 2016, and SFA procurement allocations we believe are due to be set in March 2017. So that might be notes to the diary for those of you that are looking to engage, particularly with the non-levied population, so 98% of organisations in England. So other points to note is we're eagerly awaiting the final version of the new funding rules, which the proposal is pretty much exactly what this webinar has been based upon. So we're waiting to see what parts of that are finalised, what parts that are taken forward, and potentially which bits are changed. So a key date for the diary there. And then the bottom three dates are all really Levy related. So the digital apprenticeship service that's going to support levied employers navigate their way through this change commences in April, and then we expect to see the first drawdowns of levy funding through those large employers from May 2017 onwards. And finally, all of the content of this proposal and the new funding rules that are going to be published in October will kick in May 2017. Jake, I hope I haven't missed anything there. Does that cover off the key dates?
It does indeed, yeah. It's just worth noting as well that once those final version of the rules has been published, we will be doing a follow-up webinar as well, just to summarise that for customers as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so Jake's just going to pop up some contact details should you need them on the screen. So it's mine and Jake's details if you do need any further information off the back of today's webinar. Also, if you're an existing ILM training provider or employer, you can also access further information through your business development manager, and they'll be able to support you on a local basis as well. So it's certainly worth engaging with them if needs be. If there's any employers that aren't currently engaging with ILM and would like to have some further discussions as to how they can engage with us and our training provider network, then my details are there. Please feel free to drop me an email, and happy to take discussions forward from there. So I think that brings us to a close. I'd like to thank everyone for their time today. Hope that's been helpful, and keep an eye out on the ILM website for further updates and webinars moving forward.